Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and start today's program. It's going to be packed with information and discussion, so we want to make sure we have adequate time for it. For those of joining us from outside the firm, my name is Nora Garrote. I'm the partner in charge of diversity and inclusion here at Venable. We're very happy to have you with us today, along with a lot of our colleagues from all across our firm. Um, as we close Pride Month today, we're pleased to present our second program this month, sponsored by LGBTQ at Venable. Today's program focuses at a high level on personal identity, acknowledging and understanding the key and most basic attributes of one's identity. It's not only a matter of dignity and respect, but it also leads to inclusivity in workplaces and in communities. It allows each of us to be visible, to come to work each day, and to be a part of our communities as who we are. Promoting an inclusive and welcoming workplace is fundamental to our diversity and equity goals. It is well understood that an inclusive environment will naturally attract and retain diversity of talent and of perspectives. To that effect, today's program is very special. It provides us an opportunity to learn about the spectrum of gender identity, about gender diversity, including the very prevalent use of preferred gender pronouns. We're humbled to have panelists with us today who bring significant professional and personal experience to this conversation. In addition to the learning and reflection that we will share from today's program about gender as a fundamental part of identity, earlier today we launched the Our Names Project, which is a companion program to foster inclusivity. Names, as well as gender, which we will discuss today, but names are another fundamental and most basic part of our individual identities. Yet, many times we don't take the time to know how to pronounce a colleague's name, someone else's name, know by what name they want to go by. Through this project, we will create our own individual recording for our profiles of how we pronounce our name, what we go by, and our preferred gender pronouns if one would like. Please also note that today you're able to do a custom signature block for your email signatures that include your preferred gender pronouns if you would like. You can look at mine, many of our colleagues have it. In early fall, however, I'm happy to report that the new Venable email signature template will actually include a templated data field that will allow those who would like to more easily add the gender pronouns to the signature in a way that it's consistently used throughout. Thank you again for joining us for today's program. We're really looking forward to doing this together. And we're humbled by the speakers we have with us today. Tiffany, without more, why don't we start our panel? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nora, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm sure everyone is busy in their own ways, and this is an important program, important information that, like as Nora was discussing, just makes our community at the firm or even beyond, wherever you work or you represent, just more inclusive and ensures that everyone has a place. That's really what's most important. And so with this program, our goal is to have a discussion, to have a dialogue, for this to be educational, non-judgmental. And so I say that to say we welcome any questions that anyone has. Please feel free to include it in the chat. And we'll try to include them towards the end of our presentation. But we hope that this presentation is just the beginning of your process of learning what gender identity is, what are pronouns, what is gender expression, what is the distinction between some of these terms that you might be hearing quite a bit in the news or in the workplace or amongst your friends. So without further ado, a lot of you might know me, but my name is Tiffany Williams. I am a fifth-year associate at Venable. I sit in the DC Commercial Litigation Group, and my pronouns are she and her. I am joined with three amazing panelists who are going to share their expertise, their knowledge, and their personal experience on gender identity and the importance of pronoun usage and recognizing and respecting other person's gender identities. So without further ado, I'll just go ahead and introduce our panelists and they'll appear. Our first panelist is Dr. Jenny Beeman. Now, Jenny Beeman is the director of the University of Massachusetts Stonewall Center and the coordinator of Campus Pride's Trans Policy Clearinghouse. They have published and spoken extensively on the experiences and needs of trans college students, including writing some of the first articles on the topic. Among the books that they have authored are The Lives of Transgender People and the anthology Trans People in Higher Education. Jenny recently co-edited the Sage Encyclopedia of Trans Studies. They are currently writing Campus Queer, addressing the needs of LGBTQ plus college students for Johns Hopkins University Press. They have a PhD in African American Studies and a master's degrees in African American Studies, and Higher Education Administration. Jenny's pronouns are they and them. Our next panelist is Dr. Jody Herman. Dr. Jody Herman is the Reed Rasmussen Fellow and a scholar of public policy at the Williams Institute. Her research focuses on gender identity and survey research and the prevalence and impact of discrimination based on gender identity or expression, including minority stress, health, and suicidal, the prevalence or the consistency of suicides amongst transgender people. She is a co-investigator on the U.S. Transgender Population Health Survey, or TransPop, a nationally representative survey of transgender adults. She served as co-principal investigator for the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey, the largest survey of transgender adults conducted in the United States to date. Her published research is routinely cited, including by major news sources such as the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and NPR. She holds a PhD in public policy and public administration from the George Washington University, where she also earned her master's in arts in public policy. Jody's pronouns are she and her. And last but not least, we have one of our very own, Audrey Grossman. She is a counsel in Venable's Los Angeles office and focuses her practice on estate planning and tax matters, probate, and trust administration. She also has a significant background in corporate, entertainment law, and litigation. Audrey earned her bachelor's in arts in East Asian Studies from Wittenberg University and her JD from Harvard Law School. In her spare time, she volunteers with LA Family Housing and sings mezzo-soprano in several choirs. She's a proud mother of two amazing LGBTQ plus kids, including a lesbian future daughter and a non-binary artist. Audrey's pronouns are she and her. So thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining today and speaking on topics that actually might touch you personally. So let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start with just the history and how we are here today in 2021 and kind of why these topics are important, why we're hearing these words. So Jenny, would you mind just kind of giving us a brief overview of just the history of gender identity, pronoun usage, if at all possible to sum that up in a matter of a few moments?
Sure, start with the historian. Great. There's a rich history of non-gendered and binary pronouns. For example, they in the singular dates back to the late 1300s and was really in common usage for about the next 300 to 400 years. You see it, for example, in the work of Shakespeare, Chaucer. And we still use they and them when we don't know the gender of somebody. I'm going to pick up a friend at the airport. You might say, oh, who are they? Right? Because you don't know the gender of that person. There have been many attempts to create other non-gendered pronouns throughout the centuries. In the last about 20 to 30 years, we've seen not just pronouns being used in a non-gender context, but also as non-binary, as a way to describe someone's lived identity. I came out as non-binary in the late 1990s, and there were very few folks at that time who identified as non-binary. I use Z and here for my pronouns back then. A few people were using those at the time, so I adopted that, but very quickly realized that very few people really use those, and people had a hard time remembering those and how do you spell that, pronounce that. So in the early 2000s, more and more folks started adopting they and them as not only language to describe when you don't know someone's gender, but also as a way to describe their gender. Because we already had that language, it doesn't require learning something new and different. And that's really caught on in the last decade and a half as what most people who go by a non-binary set of pronouns use for themselves.
No, that's really informative. And I actually really appreciate your point of, if the example that you gave of picking someone up from the airport and not knowing who they are, you would use the word they and them. Like we've used it plenty of times. And I don't think most people, including myself, I never actually necessarily thought of it in that way. And I like that you mentioned Z, which we will definitely get to the crux of our discussion too of pronoun usage and why is Z used, why is they and them used. But for now, kind of switching gears a little bit, we'll kind of start off kind of baseline foundational. And I post this to the entire panel, so whoever wants to raise their hand and jump on it, you're welcome to. But can you explain the difference between sex and gender? Let's just start there. Oh, you're muted, Audrey.
Yeah, this is Zoom, right? I'm happy to jump in with just a quick little response and people can join in. I think one of the most common misconceptions and a way to get at this is that one's anatomy determines their gender. So you're born with certain set of anatomy and therefore you are a boy or a girl baby. The anatomy is sex. How you identify in the world is gender. So that is a very dumbed down and simplified explanation. We could spend an hour on it, but that's where I'll start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Any other thoughts, Jenny and Jody? I think what Audrey mentioned was absolutely key. And I can't emphasize it enough. This entire panel is meant to be an introduction. It's not going to answer every single question. And there's so much more that we could talk about this for hours. But, unfortunately, we're condensed into an hour. So our hope is that, there will be additional work done even beyond this. But I do think Audrey's description is very, very good. It's just a baseline. The distinction with anatomy and also just how you identify, how anyone identifies as a person. Our next kind of topic that's tangentially related is kind of a discussion of gender identity versus sexual orientation. Kind of starting there, anyone want to address that as well?
Sure, I think the old adage that sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, whereas gender identity is who you go to bed as, is a good way to think about that.
That is accurate. No, that's very true. And sexual orientation isn't the focus of this, but I think most people probably know at least L, the G, the T, the Q, the B. They know all those things. And I think, and I say this from personal experience from people in my family, they don't know what the plus means. Like they don't know what is beyond the plus. So, and this is me kind of going off the cuff a little bit, but would any three of you be open to just kind of explaining kind of baseline again of why there are so many sexual orientations, not necessarily explaining each individual one, but kind of what does the plus mean?
Sure. In my research with college students, there's a lot of plus comes up because people have various identities, because people recognize that there are gradations and don't feel like current terminology necessarily captures that. So people come up with a term to describe themselves. And of course, social media has been really helpful in getting some of that language out there and people adopting different language. So people may come up with oh, I'm attracted to people who are non-binary. What exactly is that? There isn't a term for that. So someone came up with a term to describe scoliosexual is the term to describe someone who's attracted to people who are non-binary, and that word caught on because it got put onto social media posts, and other people adopted it either as a term for themselves or as a term to describe that. So we've just seen a proliferation of terms in the last decade and a half because of just people recognizing just the diversity and able to then sort of spread different labels out there, and some catch on.
So no, that's really helpful. So is the word queer supposed to be inclusive of all of that? Like what, I know some people say it is, you know, kind of, again, for those who don't know, who are maybe not necessarily part of the community, is queer supposed to be inclusive of, I am not, using myself as an example, I may or may not be a cisgender person. We'll get into what that means, but I am not cisgender. And I am attracted to someone who is not of the opposite sex of me. Would that be inclusive of queer, or what does queer mean?
Well, I would say it means different things to different folks. It
Okay.
is often used as an umbrella term to describe everyone who is non-heterosexual and sometimes also non-cisgender. I know we haven't really talked about what that term means yet. Other people adopt it as an identity in and of itself, that like I identify as being queer, which to me means I don't want to be put into a box when it comes to my sexual orientation, and who I'm attracted to romantically, sexually, emotionally. So I think it means different things for different people, but it's been an affirming term. Obviously, at one point it was a hostile term, and of course it still is hostile, used by some folks, but it's been taken back and embraced by many in the community as a affirming term. And for a lot of folks, it's a way to describe everyone rather than saying LGBTQIA+, which is a mouthful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so that's great. Let's transition a little bit to gender identity. And we actually have already gotten a couple questions that touch on gender identity. And so we're going to kind of wrap those into this discussion. But can you please explain, anyone, what is cisgender? And what is the difference between cisgender versus transgender?
I'm happy to start here, and please, Audrey or Jody, jump in. Transgender, or more often it's referred just as trans in the trans community, is individuals whose gender identity expression is different than how they were assigned at birth. Trans in Latin means across from, opposite from, on the other side of, beyond. So it is a term that can be used for individuals who are binary trans, which means trans women, trans men, or non-binary trans people like myself who don't identify as either female or male. And then cis, you have trans people, so people had to come up with the term for like what do you call non-trans people, right? You can't just call them non-trans. So people came up with cis. Cis individuals are individuals whose gender identity expression matches how they were assigned at birth, and in Latin, cis is the opposite, so to speak, of the word trans. Cis means next to, on the same side of.
Okay, so we have cisgender, which I identify as cisgender. I was born, I was assigned at birth female. I identify as female, and I live my life as a female. And I think that would also apply to Audrey, and that would apply to Jody as well. And so you have cisgender, and then transgender, and then, or trans, as is more commonly used. So does non-binary not fall, just to make sure for our audience members, does non-binary not fall within transgender or trans bucket or cisgender? Audrey, go ahead.
I'll just speak again from personal experience for my child who is non-binary. They identify as transgender non-binary. I don't know that that's the case for everyone who's NB, but I think it often is. In other words, their gender identity does not match the gender they were assigned at birth or the anatomy with which they were born.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say most non-binary folks identify as being trans and see non-binary is under the trans umbrella. Some folks don't, though, because trans, especially transgender, has historically been a term to refer to trans women and trans men, and so they have felt excluded from that term.
Mhm. Okay, no, that's great, and that's really, 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 really helpful. Again, we're receiving questions in live time, so I know we've gotten a couple questions about what exactly non-binary is. Audrey, would you mind speaking a little bit about, just kind of touches on your personal experience, but changing of names, and if you could just explain to what are dead names?
Okay, so a dead name is, the name that a person used, usually was born with, and then if they've gone to change their name to match their gender identity, the name that they had previously is their dead name. Okay, and this is really important. It may not seem important to some people. It's very important to someone. It is, your name is how you introduce yourself to other people. It's how you present in the world. It can often, using a dead name, the name that a person used before presenting as their authentic self in the world, it can evoke really painful memories. It can bring forth feelings of gender dysphoria. So it can be very hard for a person who has changed their name to a name that matches their gender identity to be, quote, dead named. It can be hard if you've known somebody for a long time, as I knew my child for a long time with their name at birth, to switch to a new name. And people will mess up. But it is important to try to respect a person's chosen name that is reflective of their true authentic identity.
And kind of why, I see a few similarities between this and kind of what Nora was talking about in her introduction about pronunciation of names. A little different, but has kind of similar elements of, if someone mispronounces your name, you generally correct them. And then if they say, well, I kind of prefer to call you Audrey instead of Audrey, it's disrespectful. And I mean, no one wants to be called the wrong name, and certainly no one, and I think that in certain respects, this is even more painful for people, is to be referred to by their dead name. And so there's similar elements there. I guess on that point, we all make mistakes. This happens all the time. I will speak from personal experience that I have a friend who is a trans man, and he recently came out and identified as a trans man about 2 years ago, but I knew him at least 3 years before that as a different name. And so I know in the beginning, I accidentally referred to him as she without even thinking about it. And I profusely apologized, and I caught myself immediately. I heard it the moment I said it. At this point, like, that doesn't happen anymore, but I think a lot of our audience members would like to know, any tips that you have when they misgender someone. Is it to profusely apologize? Ideally they do the work and they really try to consciously think about it when they talk to the person. But if any of you have tips for them, that'd be helpful.
Sure. So if you misgender someone in a conversation and you catch yourself, obviously apologize, but I would not apologize profusely. As someone who gets misgendered a lot, when someone apologizes profusely, like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that, I'm not used to this kind of pronouns, I didn't grow up with this, I don't want to hear that. You have sort of offended me by misgendering me. I'm feeling hurt. I don't want to have to feel sorry for you or feel like I should feel bad for you. Simply just apologize and then move on. And as you were saying, Tiffany, learn from it and get it right in the future, which may mean practicing. I had one student who in the 3 years he worked for me went from being she to they to he. And there were times I got stuck at the they and misgendered him. Thankfully, I don't think to his face, but to other folks, and they very kindly corrected me. So you need to practice. I practice with him. saying, his name and he, so whenever I thought about that person, whenever I saw him, I was using the correct pronoun. So it can take some work, but it's really important to do that kind of work. If you recognize later on that, oh shit, I misgendered that person, I think, you can apologize to them after the fact in person. That's good, so that people recognize that you're working on this. If someone in a conversation corrects you, whether it's that person or someone else, thank that person that they've done that, because that's an act of care to do that, sort of to call you in and to take a chance that you're not going to react harshly to that. It can be especially difficult if it's someone who's under you in a work situation who's doing that. So I think it's always important to thank the person for doing that. And of course, again, learn from that experience and don't be doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we're getting live questions that are really relevant to what we're talking about. So I'm gonna kind of just try to fit a couple of these in. We had one question that was, when cisgender people state up front what their pronouns are, is that patronizing?
I'll start here. I personally think that's really great, because it opens a space for other people to then feel they can share their pronouns. If someone in a situation gives their pronouns, it makes me feel like it's a more welcoming space than to be able to share mine and not feel like it's awkward that I'm the only person in the room who might be using pronouns that are non-binary or using pronouns that may not match how they appear. So I think it's always great to have that space. A lot of our staff at my universities in student affairs put their pronouns in their email signature. And if I would say I'm the only person who does that, who uses pronouns that you wouldn't expect. So it's feminine appearing individuals, have she and her, for example. And you might say, well, that's not taking much of a risk. That's not really doing anything. But I think it's really revolutionary, because it says that, look, I don't want you assuming because I look a certain way that I use a particular set of pronouns, because there are people who look very similar to me who don't use these pronouns. So I don't want you to be assuming that about me, because you cannot be assuming that about other people as well.
I also think everyone identifying for other people what their pronouns are normalizes the question, normalizes, brings to mind, you need to be aware of what somebody's pronouns are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was about to say the same thing, Audrey, which is, unfortunately we have to say normalizing, but it is ideally we get to a place where no one has to identify their pronouns, because no one makes assumptions. It's just right. Everyone's a blank slate. And so until we get to that point, I do think I try to make it a point to do it myself. I'm not consistent with it, but I do try to do it to make it a point, because otherwise too, it's kind of similar with the signature blocks on emails, wherever you work, that if it's only people who are not cisgender or who basically identify as who do not identify as cisgender are the only people who are doing it. Unfortunately, some people can interpret that as like, well, that's a weird flag. But if it's like everyone's doing it, it's like, oh, that doesn't matter. Like, of course, yeah, I guess I'll put my pronouns down.
I even have a button I sometimes wear. I don't know if that.
I kind of see it. No, I love it. Yeah, no, absolutely. Another question that we got real fast from an audience member was, they said that they're interested in an explanation of the I and the A in LGBTQIA+. They mentioned that they have a transgender self-identified child and never really understood or forgot what that distinction is. So if anyone's open to answering that question, that would be great.
Anyone correct me if I'm wrong, the I usually refers to intersex. That is actually someone who is born with chromosomes and or anatomy reflective of both biological sexes. And the A is agender or asexual, meaning a person does not identify with any gender.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well, but. Okay, we got the nod of approval from all the other panelists. So great. So Audrey, actually, I'm going to stick with you. If you could kind of speak a little bit to the lived experiences of young trans people. You mentioned that one of your children identifies as non-binary, you know, if you're open to sharing just a little bit about your family's journey, their journey, however briefly you feel comfortable.
Okay, well, I could go on forever, but I'll try not to. So my child is now 15 years old, is non-binary, came out to us initially as non-binary at age 12 or 13. We have legally changed their name and gender, which thankfully is an option available to us here in California, but sadly is not to people in a lot of the parts of the country. Unfortunately, because they were born in Tennessee, their birth certificate cannot be changed. So their birth certificate still bears the gender they were assigned at birth and their dead name. And until the laws change, that can't change. As far as in the world, you know, school is a minefield. So they, you know, dealt with bullying from other kids. That's you know, in more intense bullying than the ordinary bullying that one has in middle school. One thing we may not think a lot about is, especially in younger grades in school, everything gets divvied up by gender. Okay, boys over here, girls over there. I want the boys to do this and the girls to do that. It's so common. And for someone who is not a boy or a girl, that obviously presents a lot of issues and a lot of hurt. So it's something for people to be aware of in general, to not just divide activities and everything that you do in life by gender. Let's see, medically, my goodness. So my child also has had puberty blocker and top surgery. And getting that done, we have fabulous doctors. And there was no issue with getting it done, but we had a many months year-long fight with insurance to get coverage for it and had to get a state agency involved. And thankfully we are privileged, and I recognize my privilege. We were able to pay out of pocket for it. We were able to fight the fight with insurance to eventually get reimbursed for it. Most people don't have the financial means or the, you know, they aren't two Harvard trained lawyers to take on Blue Shield in getting it paid for. One other thing I wanted to mention, sort of harkening back to names, and then I'll leave it at that, is it can get really complicated when you're a kid. A lot of people are out and go by a chosen name and gender affirming pronouns within certain circles of their life, but not in others. They may not have supportive parents. So to their friends, they use their true name and pronouns, but not within their home, or maybe not at school. So they're constantly reminded, they're constantly dead named, misgendered in certain areas. I'll share one situation that's a little bit comical, but could have gone very wrong. My child had a friend over, and I'm not going to use real names, but let's say this friend goes by the name Ty and is non-binary. And Ty came over to our house for a sleepover. I know them as Ty. And I got a text from an unknown number that said, "Hey, thanks for having Tiffany over." I didn't know who Tiffany was. I didn't know who was texting me. Well, it was Ty's dad. Ty is not out to their dad. It could have gone really wrong if I'd said, "Who's Tiffany? Who are you? We don't know any Tiffany." Thankfully, I didn't. But sometimes you have to walk that line. If it's not safe for somebody to use their true name or their true pronouns in certain areas of their life, it's switching back and forth and back and forth. And that is something a lot of kids deal with.
And to kind of ask you an off-the-cuff question, if you feel comfortable answering, Audrey,
Sure.
is, you know, I'm not a parent, but I imagine quite a few parents ask the question of, well, if my 9-year-old, if my 14-year-old comes up to me and says that they don't identify as their assigned sex anymore, how do they know that? Like they're kids, you know, like shouldn't they wait until they're older, you know, like maybe are more inclined to be a little bit more dismissive of that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like kind of what helped you and your family? Was it just easy for you? Just kind of what that thought process was like?
It was I don't want to say easy. There are always challenges, but it was easy for us. We were very open to it. I think I can't speak for most people, but I think most people know. I mean, when did I know I was a girl? When did I know I was cisgender? From the day most people know very young who they are, and we should respect and trust that, would be my point.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing your personal story on that.
Anytime.
Let's talk a little bit about diversity of pronouns. Jenny, you kind of hit on this a little bit when I believe you mentioned that you used to identify as Z, or you had colleagues that identified as Z, and then it's kind of transitioned to they and them for some people. Can you or Jody kind of talk a little bit about the diversity of pronouns that are being used currently and diversity of gender identities?
Do you want to start, Jody?
Sure, I'll just say a little bit, just based on one of the largest surveys of trans people in the US to date. Had about 28,000 respondents, and I'll just say in that survey, we offered about 25 different gender identity labels that individuals could choose from, plus a write-in option. So some of the listed options were bigender, genderqueer, multigender, non-binary, trans, two-spirit, and a list of 25. But in addition to the 25, about 3,400 respondents wrote in their own unique gender label. And that included labels like, our identities like demigender, gray gender, gender neutral, pangender, and questioning. So gender identities are vast, and I think as Jenny referred to earlier, they're getting more specific. So there are labels for very, specific identities now that are becoming more and more common. In terms of pronouns, I'd say about a third of the respondents used she and hers, and about a third used they, them, and about a third used he and him. But about 4% of respondents overall wrote in their own option and offered about a dozen different types of pronouns that they use personally in their lives. And Z-Zier, C-Zier, Faye, Fair, I'm probably really mispronouncing those, but there's a whole list, a whole long list of very unique and specific pronouns that folks used in that survey. So Jenny, I would imagine that comports with what you found in your research as well.
Yeah, I did a study prior to the great work that Jody's done. I did what was the largest study of trans people with about 3,500, I think it was. And we had over 100 different gender identity labels of folks. Research I have done about non-binary trans folks, about 90% use they, them at this point in time. That's always going to be shifting, right? Is different people, different generations always want to have different labels for themselves, different ways of naming themselves. So I'm sure that's going to be changing. But as Jody said, there are a whole host of other pronoun options out there. Most universities and colleges that are asking pronouns, and that's a growing thing that the colleges are doing, list they, them, oftentimes have a couple other options there. Some also have name only, which is difficult to do in practice if you're really going to be spending a lot of time talking about someone just to be using their name and nothing else. But there are folks that just want name only being used. They don't want to be gendered in any sort of form or fashion.
So given what you both just said, I imagine there are some audience members that are like, wait, 25, or like, man, there's this many pronouns. Like, how am I supposed to know this? You're telling me not to make assumptions, but I walk up to someone, like, what am I supposed to do? Should they treat it the same as they meet me for the first time and they ask what my name is? Or do they wait for me to introduce my pronouns and my gender identity at some point organically in the conversation?
In my experience, and I learned a lot from students and watching them, that it's just part of the conversation. Hi, I'm so-and-so, I use these pronouns for myself. And, you know, it's just part of the way to introduce yourself, or in meetings to go around and people say names and pronouns or whatever other information people are asked to share. It just becomes organic then in a way. And this generation, Gen Z, is just so used to asking pronouns because they recognize that you can't assume that there are more and more folks identifying in various non-binary ways and not ways that you can't make assumptions.
Right. No, and I think that's key too. In a consistent theme, one of the questions we've gotten is actually very relevant to this. Audience member asks, if someone's pronouns are he, they, or she, they, is that generally an indication the person is comfortable with people using either set of pronouns, or would they rather people alternate between the pronouns?
It varies by person with that. For some folks, by that, they mean that they're gender fluid. And so they would want you to be using different pronouns in your conversation with them. For other folks, it's an indication that they use one set of pronouns in one kind of context and another set of pronouns in another context. So like anything else, you have to, like, even if someone tells you like, oh, this is how I identify, you know that's what that means, because I identify as genderqueer, but that might mean something very different to me than someone else who identifies as genderqueer. So all of this, you really have to ask for a little bit of explanation to know exactly what it is that they're talking about, so that you're being respectful.
And I think just to add into that I know oftentimes people ask these questions because, not necessarily this one, but generally any questions about this, because they're afraid of offending somebody. I think my personal view is, whether it's about gender identity or sexual orientation or whatever it may be, or if it's my name, I'm not going to be offended if you're coming to me asking me out of respect. I want to understand how you identify, who you are. Can you please tell me? I would absolutely tell someone, and I appreciate that they took the time to do that. And I can't fault them for that. I can't fault you for something that you don't know. Certainly something that you may not necessarily understand. I say that with the caveat that you still have to do your own work and, understand necessarily what these things mean. But at least in my personal view, more often than not, if you just ask someone from a place of trying to understand and trying to respect them and see them for who they are, then it's generally well received. But let me know if anyone disagrees.
Yeah, I think it may feel uncomfortable to be asking someone what their pronouns are, but I think in time you get more comfortable doing that. Like I said, the younger people are much more comfortable with that. And I think it's much more uncomfortable if you end up misgendering someone because you didn't ask.
Yeah, absolutely. I just have a few more points that I want to make sure that we get through before our time comes to an end. Jody, if you can kind of just speak a little bit about the official state level and federal level data surveys that you've been involved in, and kind of what those population statistics say, and what does it show about what our government does or does not know about the trans population?
Sure. So one of the reasons that the large U.S. trans survey that I spoke about briefly, and the type of research that Jenny does, it's so important, because we don't learn from the usual avenues about the trans population. So for instance, there's no way to use census data in order to identify the size of the trans population or the characteristics of the trans population. All these official surveys that give us population indicators from the United States, it's a very rare circumstance where they ask questions to identify trans people, to identify non-binary people, even to identify sexual orientation. So we learn about the trans population from a handful of these large national and state level population-based surveys that are usually run through official government agencies. But we also learn by studies done by academics. We learn about studies done by clinicians. We learn from studies done by community-based organizations doing their own surveys of their own membership and their own communities. So we've, at the Williams Institute, we've had to take, a variety of data sources to try to put out into the world what we think we know about the trans population, about non-binary people. So a colleague of mine, his was a real stats whiz. He was able to kind of take these pieces of data that are incomplete nationally, and we used data from the CDC's behavior risk factor surveillance system to estimate that about 0.6% of the US adult population identifies as transgender. We're refining those estimates now because we have more years of data available, which is great. Data is good. I'm a big data nerd, so I love the data. But the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is another official survey of youth in high schools, and they found that across 19 high schools, 1.8% identified as transgender. And then there was a recent study that was just done in some high schools in Pittsburgh, and they found that 10% of youth were identifying as trans or non-binary or genderqueer or some like non-cisgender identity. So I think the point of this, and Jenny can speak more about this too, but I think overall we see a trend of higher levels of identification as trans or a variety of non-cisgender identities among youth. And so I think that's kind of like the trend. And I think for Venable, for employers, the incoming young, entry-level folks coming into organizations and being hired by employers now are just more likely than prior generations to have diverse identities. So I think that's just a kind of a real thing for employers out there to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually a really good transition into some other data that Jenny has. I'm going to share my screen real fast. And this will actually involve a poll. So our audience gets to be interactive and enjoy. Let's see here. So you should receive a poll notification. We have a couple questions, and feel free to choose out of these few options. So the first question will be, what % of college students are non-cis? Your best guess. And then second question will be, what are the most common non-cis identities? And we will give you about 20 seconds to think on that. Okay, all right. So you've had some time. Jenny, I'll let you take over from here. I'll just control the PowerPoint.
Sure. Do you want to show the poll results?
Reveal it. Oh, yes. Let me do that. Okay, so poll results show about 12% of you believe at least 12% of college students are non-cis. And as to the second question, about 52%, actually here, I'll hold off on the second question. Let's just go through the first question.
Sure, so just want to go advance the slide,
Yeah.
please?
Yes, sorry. Here we go.
Yeah, so it's about 3%. It's a little bit higher than what Jody was talking about. And we've seen this figure for Gen Z rising pretty much consistently over the last 5 years that this has been asked. This comes from probably the best data we have on college student and how they identify. If you want to go to the next slide.
Yep.
This is the different options that they offer, and you can see, thank you, that yes, non-binary is the largest, but I've highlighted here, really, there are many different ways that people identify as non-binary. It's by far the majority of how people identify themselves in this. This is I'm stealing Jody's research here, wonderful research done on the trans community. This is comparison of research done in 2011 versus 2000 and well, data from 2007, 2008 with data from 2015. And you just see there the number of folks who are identifying as non-binary, how quickly that has grown from gender nonconforming is what was used in the earlier study, from 12% to more than a third. And that reflects, on the next slide, it reflects just the age of the folks who are identifying this. Again, this is from the US Transgender Survey that Jody led. You see just 18 to 24 being more 42%, far larger than the age in the general population. So the rise in non-binary really reflects the rise in Gen Z folks who are involved in research, who are coming out. And next slide. This talks what I mentioned a little bit earlier about just this generation is growing up either identifying as non-binary themselves or knowing folks who identify as non-binary. So you see here that the number of folks who identified having someone in their lives who uses non-binary pronouns for themselves, very much a generational thing. And then the next couple slides just speak to just how quickly this has become a thing. I've been at this, as I said, for 20 some years, and it used to be when I said it, I wanted newspapers and other media to refer to me as they, them. I got pushback on that, and they said, I've talked to my editor, and I'm not sure we can do that. Now they just do it as a matter of course, because all of the style guides, all of the online dictionaries recognize they and them in the singular and are accepting that. It's so popular that it's the word of the year by different organizations, word of the decade. Next slide. We're seeing more and more options in various social media for people to identify their pronouns and their gender identities. Facebook is led the way on this, but most other media platforms now give people a way to identify their gender beyond simply an M&F. And then we're seeing more and more states give a non-binary option of X on driver's license and state IDs and on birth certificates. We just had today, the federal government announcing they're going to have an X on passports by the end of this year. So we're just seeing a rise in the recognition of non-binary. So that's just really amazing how quickly that's happened.
Great. Let's see here. No, thank you so much for that, Jenny. And kind of one of the last points that we want to touch on real fast in our remaining few minutes is kind of the impact of discrimination based on gender identity or expression. Since Jody and Jenny are the data people, I am not a data person, so either one of you feel free to jump in to kind of discuss what the numbers say.
Well, I will just talk about what we've learned from survey research, is that like the US Trans Survey, we asked about a variety of experiences with discrimination across major areas of life, including like employment, school context, housing, education, public accommodations. But people were experiencing a variety of people were having a variety of discriminatory experiences, whether it's, from not being hired after, revealing or either, coming out as transgender or a potential employer suspects they're transgender. There are people who have been offered jobs and those job offers have been retracted once it has come to light that they are transgender. There are ways in which, when coming out in the workplace, that employers have treated trans people differently, perhaps removing them from interactions with clients, ways in which to reduce the public interaction of that employee. So there's a variety of experiences that take place in the employment context, but also in the school context. Audrey spoke a little bit about this earlier, but just going from, that singular individual Audrey is speaking about, and data and surveys like this allow us to look en masse, see what's happening across a variety of people and identities. And what we have found in these surveys is that the experiences of discrimination are pervasive across all these areas. And the problem with that is not only is that wrong, but in and of itself, but that discriminatory experiences can actually have a variety of negative impacts on people's lives. Not only economic well-being when it comes to employment discrimination, but also in mental and physical health. Minority stress is a concept that describes how stigmatized minorities in society can experiences of stigma can actually have an impact on mental health and well-being. And so we definitely see that in elevated rates of psychological distress among trans people who've experienced discrimination. In economic well-being, we see higher levels of poverty among trans people who've experienced employment discrimination. So discriminatory experiences do have a very real impact on people's lives. And so laws, statutes, organizational level policies to try to reduce discrimination can have potentially a positive effect, not only on just those discrete experiences of discrimination, but on people's health and well-being.
Well, I just want to jump in, if I may, quickly to mention how the state by state nature of our laws really has an impact. You know, whether you can legally change your name or gender, whether you can use the bathrooms that coordinate with your gender identity, often depends on where you live. There were a lot of reasons, but a primary reason why we moved from Tennessee to California 2 years ago was so my child could be safe.
And we're seeing the same thing happen now with all the anti-trans laws that are being introduced at the state level, with trans people or the parents of trans children thinking about, I got to get someplace else to protect myself or protect my family. I've talked to a number of
Absolutely.
who are looking to move to my state and looking for resources here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also have the trans man I mentioned earlier works at another large law firm. Fortunately, that firm has extensive benefits for people who do not identify as cisgender, including covering surgery if that's what they choose. And that was a big factor for him. And that was not the case at a lot of law firms. And that's just one example. And thank you, Jody, for speaking on the discrimination element. I know we're actually technically a little bit past time, but I just want to answer a few of these questions because we received so many. So we'll just go through a couple. And then I have one last question for everyone, because I've received a lot of questions asking, where can I learn more? So just throwing that out there so you can think on that. So we have suggestions for our audience members. But one question that we had was, let's see. An audience member asked, is it disrespectful to refer to someone by their new identity when discussing stories or memories from prior to their transition? In a sense, is it rude to attribute their former experiences under their now dead name to their current identity?
I think you should, please.
Go ahead.
I think you should always refer to someone as how they identify now, even if you're talking about them in the past, because chances are they have long felt that they were the gender identity that they are now, but were not able to express that, didn't feel comfortable coming out. So even if they were, as a child or as a teen, not openly identifying as how they identify now, they probably felt that way. So it's always good to affirm them as how they are now, even if in the past they weren't using that identity or that set of pronouns.
It's exactly what I was going to say. I know my child doesn't, even if we're talking about a time when they were a tiny person who went by a different name and gender at the time, they are tall and they are non-binary. And they went through a period of going through old things where they had written their name on them and scratching it out and writing their new name because they didn't want it to appear anywhere.
Wow, no, that's really, really great. And also, I can't read all these, but we're getting so many comments and messages of encouragement. One person said Tennessee's loss is LA's gain. So, we got Audrey.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another question that we received was kind of what can sorry, I lost the question just for a split second. Oh, here we go. What is some pragmatic advice for what cis and straight people can do to push those who are not behind the times, or who are a bit behind the times rather, to move them to a place of more respect, especially in the current day-to-day workplace?
I think role modeling the behavior is always a good thing, to change workplace culture so that inclusion of LGBT folks is a norm. I think is really important. So if you're modeling appropriate behavior of inclusion and other folks are, I think that sends a powerful signal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I completely agree. I think people in positions of power, I mean, I think that's where it all starts. Where what leaders do, people follow. Just out of respect for everyone's time, I just want to make sure, I thought I maybe saw another one, but we have so many questions, so I'll wrap that up. But last question to the group again, what are some resources that our audience members can refer to learn more about everything that we discussed?
PFLAG is a great organization. Maybe Jody or Jenny can tell me what the actual acronym stands for, but it is an organization for parents, friends, etc. of queer people.
Actually, just go by PFLAG now because the acronym PFLAG has L and G in it, but not other letters. They just use
Gotcha.
PFLAG.
Okay, we have formerly PFLAG. Jody?
Yeah, PFLAG is great. If you want to see I think somebody posted in the Q&A, they want to see the list of gender identities. So if you want to learn more about how trans folks are personally identifying and some of the experiences that they're reporting, like I mentioned prior, the US Trans Survey report is available online. It's several hundred pages long, so be sure to look at the table of context to find the topic that interests you, but it's available at www.ustranssurvey.org. And you can find an executive summary too that does a really nice job of summing things up. But that's one resource that's available from a study, but there's also other community-based resources that you might, like on UCLA campus, we have the LGBT Resource Center. So there might be LGBT resource centers or LGBT centers in your community that might have good, maybe even locally focused resources.
Great. Jenny?
There's just so much out there now. It's just amazing. It's hard for me as a trans researcher to even keep up with everything that's being published. So it's so easy to find good stuff. You can Google and find stuff online as well as in books and journals. So I including things I've written. So there's so much out there.
Great. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much to our three panelists for vulnerable conversation and just information. And thank you so much, Nora, as well, for your continued support for Pride Month and beyond too. So thank you everyone for attending. Nora, did you have any last remarks you want to add?
Oh, thank you. This was amazing. Thank you, Jody, Jenny, and Audrey. I think we're better for it today. We've learned a lot, and hopefully we'll continue the reflection and conversation on this. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
And
thank you, everyone.
To our audience.
Yes, take care.